11 cents. That was the total profit Elena Moreau made on the last loaf of sourdough she sold before the city's power grid gave out. She sat in the dim glow of a single candle in the kitchen of Stella Bakery, smoothing out a crumpled foreclosure notice that demanded $45,000 by Monday morning. This bakery was her life's blood, the only thing her father left her besides his recipes. But her late husband had been a man of expensive secrets. Before the accident, he had used the bakery as collateral for a gambling debt Elena hadn't discovered until the collectors started throwing bricks through her windows. Now, she was a widow and a mother, drowning in a sea of red ink she hadn't spilled. In the small apartment above the ovens, her 6-year-old son, Lucas, slept in his coat to stay warm, clutching a wooden rolling pin like a teddy bear. Her phone buzzed, the screen cracked but bright with a text from the developer, Mr. Sterling. "The wrecking ball is already scheduled, Elena. Sign the deed over tonight and I'll let you keep your dignity. Fight me and you'll be on the street by dawn." She flipped the phone face down, her jaw tight with a silent vow. The vulture would have to pry the keys from her cold, flour-dusted hands. Then, the heavy thrum of engines vibrated through the floorboards. Not a delivery truck. 3 obsidian black sedans pulled onto the curb, their headlights cutting through the city's darkness like searchlights looking for a fugitive. The cold inside the bakery was a different kind of monster than the cold in the streets. It was a hollow, silent chill that tasted of stale yeast and failure. Elena Moreau stood at the heavy wooden prep table, her knuckles white as she kneaded a final, small batch of dough. There was no power for the industrial mixers, so she worked by hand, her muscles aching with a rhythmic, desperate intensity. Every push against the dough was a strike against the bank, against the developer, and against the ghost of a husband who had gambled away the roof over their son's head. The fire in the old brick oven flickered low, cast in orange hues that danced off the final eviction notice pinned to the wall like a death warrant. Elena wiped a stray lock of hair from her forehead, leaving a streak of white flour across her skin. She looked toward the ceiling, listening for the soft creak of floorboards that would tell her Lucas was still asleep. He was the only reason she hadn't let the fire go out. He was the only reason she was still standing in a bankrupt shop at midnight, while the city outside descended into a blackout-fueled chaos. The roar of the engines had stopped, but the silence that followed was heavier. Elena froze as the shadow of a man darkened the frosted glass of the front door. He didn't knock like a customer. He struck the wood with a heavy, rhythmic authority that demanded acknowledgement. When she pulled the bolt and cracked the door, the smell of expensive tobacco and rain-soaked wool flooded the warm, yeasty air of the shop. Don Alessio Ravelli stood there, an atmospheric force that seemed to push the very oxygen out of the room. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped into the light of her single candle, his presence instantly making the spacious bakery feel small, fragile, and exposed. His eyes swept over the room, landing on the empty display cases, the flickering oven, and finally, the foreclosure notice. A faint, knowing smirk touched his lips, though his eyes remained as cold as the rain on his coat. "You're Elena," he said, not as a question, but as a fact he had already bought and paid for. "We're closed," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain composed. "I have no bread left to sell." Alessio reached into his coat, pulling out a roll of bills bound by a silver clip. He set it on the flour-dusted counter, a sum of money that would have paid her flour bill for a year. "I'm not here for bread, Signora. I'm here for the silence. My men will occupy the perimeter. You will keep the ovens hot, and you will not ask questions." Elena looked at the money, then at the man who looked like he could crush her world with a single phone call. The fire in the oven popped, sending a shower of sparks behind the grate. In that moment, the vulture, Sterling, felt like a distant threat compared to the predator standing in her kitchen. She was trapped between the fire and the storm, and as Alessio's men began to file in, she realized the bakery would never be the same again. The heavy glass door groaned on its hinges as Elena stepped back, allowing the frigid air and the 3 men to sweep inside. The scent of expensive cologne, rain-drenched wool, and something metallic, something like ozone before a lightning strike, filled the small, flower-scented space. Don Alessio didn't wait for an invitation to move. He walked to the center of the room, his presence instantly making the bakery feel like a birdcage. He surveyed the empty display cases and the past due notices scattered on the counter with a clinical, detached gaze. One of his men positioned himself at the front window, peering through the blinds at the dark street, while the other moved toward the back exit. They moved with a silent, synchronized lethality that made Elena's pulse thrum in her throat. "You have a back room," Alessio stated, rather than asked. His eyes finally locked onto hers, intense and unblinking. One with no windows and a reinforced door. Elena wiped her damp palms on her apron, her voice trembling but steady. "It's the storage room. It's where I keep the bulk grain and the old dough mixer. But my son is upstairs. I can't have." "Your son is safe," Alessio interrupted, his voice a low, soothing vibration that didn't entirely mask the threat beneath it. He reached into his inner jacket pocket, and for a split second, Elena's breath hitched, expecting steel. Instead, he pulled out a roll of high-denomination bills, bound by a silver clip. He set it on the flour-dusted counter. "I am not here to disrupt your home, Signora. I am here because the city outside has lost its mind, and I require a temporary headquarters where the walls don't talk." He leaned in slightly, claiming the air between them. "Here are my terms. I take the back room. My men stay at the entrances. In exchange, no one, not the rioters, not the police, and certainly not the vultures trying to take your deed, will cross this threshold. You will continue to bake. The smell of fresh bread is the best camouflage for a man like me." Elena looked from the money, enough to pay 3 months of arrears, to the man who looked like he could end her life with a nod. "And if I say no?" Alessio's expression didn't change, but his eyes softened with a grim sort of respect. "Then we go back into the rain, and you go back to counting your 11 cents while Mr. Sterling's men prepare their hammers for Monday morning. You are facing a storm, Elena. I am simply offering you a sturdier roof." The choice felt like a trap, yet as she looked at the dark street where shadows moved in the blackout, she realized the dawn was the only shield she had. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold silver clip as she took the money. "The back room is through the kitchen," she whispered. "Just stay away from the stairs." The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing the freezing city air out and a thick, suffocating tension in. Elena stood by the cooling ovens, her fingers trembling as she wiped them on her flour-stained apron. The bakery, usually a sanctuary of yeast and cinnamon, was suddenly occupied by shadows. Don Alessio's men didn't sprawl out or relax. They moved with a silent, predatory efficiency. One stood by the front window, his silhouette partially obscured by a rack of cooling loaves, his eyes never leaving the darkened street. Another moved to the back exit, checking the deadbolt with a gloved hand. They were wolves in a house built for sheep, their polished leather holsters and sharp suits clashing violently with the whimsical pastel tiles and the smell of sugar. Alessio himself pulled out a rickety wooden chair, one Elena's father had built 40 years ago, and sat. The chair groaned under his weight, a fragile protest in the silence. He placed a heavy, matte black handgun on the floured table. The sight of it made Elena's stomach turn. It looked like a stain on her life's work. "You look like you're waiting for a ghost, Signora," Alessio said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to make the glass display cases hum. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at a framed photograph of her father on the wall. "I'm waiting for the reason," Elena whispered, her voice cracking. "Men like you don't end up in places like this by accident." "The reason is outside," he replied, gesturing toward the blackout-shrouded city. "In here, there is only the bread and the silence. Keep the silence, and I will ensure nothing disturbs the bread." Every creak of the floorboards felt like a gunshot. Elena tried to stay busy, moving pans she had already cleaned, but her eyes kept darting to the ceiling. Above them, the floor groaned. Lucas was stirring in his sleep. The sound caught Alessio's attention instantly. His hand hovered near the weapon on the table, his body coiled like a spring. "It's just my son," Elena said quickly, stepping forward as if to shield the staircase with her own body. The Don's gaze shifted to her, intense and unreadable. For a heartbeat, the king of the concrete looked not at a victim, but at a mother. He slowly withdrew his hand from the gun, resting his interlaced fingers on the table instead. "The boy should sleep," Alessio murmured, the hardness in his eyes flickering for the briefest second. "The night is long, and tomorrow the world will ask much of both of you." Elena didn't respond. She retreated to the corner, sinking onto a flour sack. She watched the glowing tips of the men's cigarettes through the window and the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of Alessio's chest. The first night had begun, a night where the scent of death and the aroma of rising dough mingled in the dark, and Elena realized she wasn't just guarding a bakery anymore. She was guarding a fuse that could ignite at any moment. The heavy silence of the blackout was broken only by the rhythmic creak of the floorboards upstairs. In the kitchen, Elena froze, her hand midair as she polished a marble counter that had seen better days. Across the room, Don Alessio sat at the small, scratched wooden table where she usually helped Lucas with his homework. He was reading a ledger by the light of a single taper candle, his sharp profile looking like it was carved from the very shadows that filled the room. His two men stood like stone statues by the darkened storefront windows, their silhouettes cutting jagged shapes against the moonlight. Then, a soft patter of bare feet echoed from the staircase. "Mama." The small, sleepy voice drifted into the room. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She had told Lucas to stay in bed, to stay quiet, to stay hidden. But a 6-year-old's world was defined by curiosity, not the calculations of dangerous men. Lucas appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes with one hand and dragging his tattered stuffed dragon by the tail with the other. He stopped short, his eyes widening as he took in the strangers. The two guards shifted instinctively, their hands moving toward their jackets, but a sharp, nearly imperceptible raise of Alessio's hand froze them in place. The Don didn't look up from the ledger immediately. He turned a page, the paper crisp in the silence. "Lucas, baby, come here," Elena whispered, her voice trembling as she reached for him. But Lucas didn't run to her. He was staring at the man in the expensive suit. With the fearless innocence of a child who hadn't yet learned what a monster looked like, Lucas walked straight toward the table. "You're sitting in my chair," Lucas said, his voice small but clear. Elena felt the air leave her lungs. "Lucas, no." Alessio Ravelli finally looked up. The candlelight caught the intensity in his dark eyes, reflecting a depth of focus that usually made grown men tremble. He looked at the boy, then down at the small chair he was indeed occupying. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Slowly, the Don closed the ledger. He didn't scold. He didn't growl. Instead, he looked at the stuffed dragon. "This is a fortress tonight, little one," Alessio said, his voice dropping to a low, melodic resonance that lacked its usual edge of iron. "And in a fortress, the commander sits where he can see the door." Lucas tilted his head, considering this. "Are you a commander?" "Something like that," Alessio replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver coin, sliding it across the wood toward the boy. "For the rent of the chair." Lucas picked up the coin, his eyes bright. For a moment, the predator and the child shared a look of silent understanding, a bridge built over a chasm of darkness. Elena watched, her hand over her heart, realizing that for the first time in years, the crushing weight of the world felt just a little bit lighter, held up by the steady, dangerous hands of a man she was supposed to fear. The heavy silence of the blackout was broken only by the rhythmic scrape of a metal spatula against the marble workspace. In the glow of 3 thick beeswax candles, Don Alessio Ravelli had shed his suit jacket. His silk shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and etched with the faint, jagged white lines of old battles. Elena watched from the shadows of the pantry, her breath catching. She had expected the man who controlled the city's docks to be discussing territory or shipments. Instead, he was looking down at 6-year-old Lucas, who sat perched on a high stool, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. "The secret, Piccolo, isn't in the cream," Alessio said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intimate register. "The world thinks the filling is the prize, but they are wrong." He picked up a golden-brown cannoli shell, holding it between his thumb and forefinger with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man of his reputation. He turned it slowly, the candlelight catching the bubbles in the pastry. "It is the geometry of the shell," Alessio continued, sliding a small knife toward Luca's. "If the shell is weak, the cream makes it soggy. If it is too thick, it shatters and ruins the experience. It must be a fortress, strong enough to hold the weight but delicate enough to give way when you take a bite. Do you understand?" Luca's nodded tentatively, his small hand reaching out to touch the flaked pastry. "Like a shield." A ghost of a smile touched Alessio's scarred face. "Exactly like a shield. Life will try to fill you with things that make you soft, things that try to break you from the inside out. You must build your shell correctly. Not too hard, or you'll never feel the sweetness, but never, ever too thin." With the precision of a surgeon, Alessio showed the boy how to pipe the ricotta mixture. Steady, even pressure, starting from the center and working outward. He didn't rush. Outside, the city was screaming with sirens and the wind of the brewing storm. But inside the circle of candlelight, there was only the geometry of the perfect pastry. For a moment, Elena saw something shift in the Don's intense gaze. The cold calculation was gone, replaced by a hauntingly sharp focus, as if he were back in a kitchen 30 years ago, learning the same lesson from a father he'd lost to the streets. He wasn't just teaching a boy how to fill a cannoli, he was showing him how to stand firm when the world turned cold. When Lucas finally took a bite, the crunch echoed in the quiet shop. The boy's face lit up, a genuine spark of joy that Elena hadn't seen since the foreclosure notices started arriving. Alessio wiped a stray bit of cream from the boy's chin with a silk handkerchief, his expression turning back to stone as his radio crackled with a dark report from the street. The lesson was over, but the fortress had begun to rise. The bakery was never truly silent anymore. Even in the dead of night, the building hummed with the heavy, rhythmic breathing of men who slept like soldiers, one eye open, hands never far from their holsters. The smell of yeast and sugar, once the only sense in Elena's world, was now layered with the sharp, metallic tang of gun oil and the expensive tobacco Alessio favored. Elena moved through the kitchen like a ghost, her bare feet silent on the cold linoleum. She had come down for a glass of water, her mind racing with the technicalities of the sourdough she needed to prep for the morning. But as she approached the heavy swinging doors that led to the storage room where Alessio's 2 primary lieutenants were stationed, the low vibration of voices stopped her cold. "The shipment was intercepted at the docks," a voice hissed. It was Marco, the younger one with the jagged tattoo on his neck. "There's no way the feds knew the timing unless someone inside opened their mouth." Elena froze, her hand hovering inches from the door. She knew she should turn back, should retreat to the safety of the stairs and pretend she was just a baker again. But the mention of a leak sent a chill down her spine. If Alessio was being hunted from within, the bakery was no longer a sanctuary, it was a trap. "The Don already knows," the second voice replied, deeper and more weary. "He's just waiting to see who flinches first. He's watching everyone, even the woman." Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, even the woman. To them, she wasn't a person. She was a variable, a potential liability. "You think she's involved?" Marco asked, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor echoing in the small space. "She's desperate. Desperate people do stupid things for money." The older man grunted. "Sterling has deep pockets. If he offered her enough to save this crumbling pile of bricks, who's to say she wouldn't sell the Don's location? One phone call is all it takes." Elena felt a surge of indignant heat rise in her chest, momentarily masking her fear. She had opened her doors to them when the city was in chaos. She had fed them. She had kept their secrets. The idea that they viewed her as a common informant stung more than she expected. "If he finds out it's her," Marco whispered, "he won't just walk out that door. He'll burn the whole block down to make a point." Suddenly, a heavy floorboard groaned beneath Elena's weight. The voices inside the room snapped into a lethal silence. The click of a safety being disengaged was the only warning she had. Before she could bolt, the swinging door flew open. Marco stood there, his silhouette framed by the dim emergency lights, his hand resting on the grip of his weapon. Behind him, the shadows of the storage room looked like a hungry mouth. "Looking for something, Signora?" he asked, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. Elena clutched her empty glass to her chest, her voice trembling but her gaze holding his. "Just water," she whispered, though she knew the air between them had changed forever. The whispers in the dark had pulled back the curtain. The Don wasn't just hiding from the law, he was hunting a traitor, and now he was hunting her too. The sun hadn't yet crested the horizon when Elena's internal clock, tuned to years of early shifts, pulled her from a restless sleep. For a moment, she lay still in the cold apartment, listening for the drip, drip, drip of the leaky pipe in the bathroom that had been the rhythm of her life for months. Silence. She sat up, a cold prickle of unease sliding down her spine. The silence was wrong. In a bakery this old, silence usually meant something had finally given out for good. Shivering, she threw on a heavy cardigan and crept toward the small bathroom. She expected to find the floor flooded or the faucet rusted shut. Instead, she found the porcelain basin bone dry and gleaming. She reached out with a trembling hand and turned the handle. The water didn't sputter or cough up the usual rust-brown sludge. It rushed out in a clear, powerful stream, hot, steaming, and perfect. Elena gasped, pulling her hand back as if the water itself were a miracle. She knelt, peering under the sink where a bucket had lived for half a year to catch the overflow. The bucket was gone. In its place stood brand-new copper pipes, the joints soldered with professional precision. The metal was still slightly warm to the touch. "Ghosts," she whispered, the word catching in her throat. She hurried downstairs to the main kitchen, her breath hitching as she pushed open the swinging doors. The blackout still gripped the city, but the bakery was no longer freezing. The massive industrial oven, a beast that usually required a prayer and a hammer to start, was humming with a low, steady heat. The pilot light, which she had spent an hour trying to ignite the night before, burned a steady, confident blue. Standing in the center of the kitchen, Elena looked around. The stacked crates of flour that had been haphazardly piled near the door were now neatly organized on reinforced shelving. The walk-in cooler, which had been rattling toward its death, purred like a contented cat. There was no one in the room, but the scent of expensive tobacco and cedar wood lingered in the air, a phantom trail left by the man who sat in the shadows of her dining area. She turned toward the front of the shop and saw a single figure standing by the window, his silhouette cutting a sharp, dark line against the gray morning light. It wasn't the Don, but one of his silent sentries, the one they called Gianni. He didn't turn around, but his voice was a low rumble in the quiet room. "The boss doesn't like his morning espresso made with stagnant water, Signora, and he finds the sound of a leak distracting." Elena looked at her hands, still stained with the gray dust of yesterday's struggle. She had spent years begging the bank for a loan and months pleading with the developer for more time, only to be met with cold indifference. Now, a man who dealt in shadows had fixed her world while she slept, not because she asked, but because he demanded order in his temporary kingdom. It was a terrifying kind of kindness, a gift that came with the weight of an invisible debt. For the first time in a long time, the ovens were ready, but as Elena began to sift the flour, her heart beat with a new kind of rhythm. The realization that she was no longer the only one who had the keys to her life. The morning air inside La Stella Bakery was thick with the scent of yeast and the heavy, silent tension of men who moved like shadows. Don Alessio sat at the small, scarred wooden table in the corner, a cup of black espresso in his hand. He hadn't said a word since dawn, his intense gaze fixed on the front door as his two bodyguards stood like statues near the flour sacks. Elena moved with forced rhythm, her hands trembling as she kneaded dough, trying to ignore the way the sunlight glinted off the polished metal of the handguns tucked beneath the men's jackets. The peace was shattered by a sharp, arrogant rhythmic pounding on the glass. Elena's heart plummeted. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Mr. Sterling pushed his way inside before she could reach the door. He was a man who smelled of expensive cologne and cheap greed, wearing a charcoal suit that looked out of place against the flour-dusted floor. He didn't notice the men in the shadows immediately. His eyes were locked on Elena with the predatory hunger of a man who smelled blood in the water. "Morning, Elena," Sterling drawled, tossing a thick manila envelope onto the cooling rack. "I hope you've spent your night packing. The city's power might be back on, but your time has officially run out. I've got the demolition crew on standby." Elena wiped her hands on her apron, squaring her shoulders despite the cold fear clawing at her throat. The deadline isn't until Monday, Sterling. Get out of my shop. Sterling let out a sharp, jagged laugh, leaning over the counter until he was inches from her face. Don't play the martyr. Your husband was a loser who gambled away your son's roof, and you're just a baker playing dress-up in a dead man's debt. Sign the papers, take the $5,000 I'm offering for your dignity, and vanish. Otherwise, I'll make sure the city inspectors find enough violations in this rat hole to put you in a cell before noon. He reached out, his fingers hovering near the collar of her uniform, his voice dropping to a hiss. You're alone, Elena. No one is coming to save a bankrupt widow. She isn't alone. The voice was low, a rhythmic growl that seemed to vibrate the very jars of cinnamon on the shelves. Sterling froze. He turned slowly, his eyes finally adjusting to the dim corner where Alessio Ravelli sat. The Don didn't stand. He simply leaned back, his dark brows lowered in a look of cold calculation. The two shadowy figures behind him stepped forward into the light, their posture claiming the space with a quiet, dominant authority. Sterling's face went from flushed red to a sickly, translucent gray. He looked at the tailored suit, the scarred jawline, and the sheer, controlled power radiating from the man in the corner. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The vulture had spent his life bullying the weak, but he had just realized he was standing in a room with a wolf. The morning air inside La Stella was thick with the scent of yeast and unspoken tension. For 3 days, Alessio and his men had been shadows in the back rooms, a silent engine humming behind closed doors. But today, the atmosphere changed. The blackout had lifted, but the air felt heavier, charged with the static of an approaching storm that had nothing to do with the weather. Elena was wiping down the counter, her hands trembling slightly, when the bell above the door shrieked. It wasn't a customer. It was Mr. Sterling. He marched in with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, flanked by a local building inspector who clutched a clipboard like a weapon. Time up, Elena, Sterling announced, his voice echoing off the tile walls. He tossed a heavy folder onto the glass display case, right next to a tray of fresh cannoli. I told you the wrecking ball was scheduled. We're here for the final walkthrough. By noon, this star of yours is officially extinguished. Elena stood her ground, her knuckles white as she gripped a damp cloth. The deadline isn't until Monday, Sterling. You have no right to be behind this counter. I have the right of the checkbook, darling, Sterling sneered, leaning over the glass. And looking at these empty shelves, I'd say you can't even afford the flour to bake a goodbye cake. Now, step aside. Or I'll have the officer outside remove you for trespassing. Before Elena could find her voice, a door at the back of the shop clicked open. The sound was small, but it cut through Sterling's bravado like a blade. Don Alessio Ravelli stepped into the light of the storefront. He wasn't wearing his coat. He was in a crisp, white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the edge of a dark tattoo on his forearm. He moved with a predatory grace, pulling a chair from a nearby table and turning it around to sit. He didn't look at Sterling. He looked at a small espresso cup in his hand. The color drained from Sterling's face, so fast it was as if a plug had been pulled. The building inspector dropped his pen. The lady said you have no right to be here, Alessio said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that made the windows vibrate. He took a slow sip of the coffee, then finally looked up, his dark eyes locking onto Sterling. I find myself agreeing with her, and I generally find that when I agree with someone, the world becomes a very difficult place for those who don't. Sterling stammered, his confident posture collapsing into a frantic, stuttering mess. I didn't know, this is a private business matter, Mr. Ravelli. I had no idea you were involved. I am a lover of fine bread, Alessio said, standing up slowly. He was a head taller than Sterling, his presence claiming every inch of oxygen in the room. He stepped forward until he was inches from the developer's face. And I dislike vultures who try to feast before the heart has stopped beating. This bakery isn't closing. In fact, it's just beginning to grow. He reached out, his hand hovering near Sterling's throat just to adjust the man's crooked tie. The developer didn't breathe. Leave the folder, Alessio whispered. And if I see your car on this block again, I'll assume you've come to donate your entire estate to the Moreau family." Sterling didn't wait for a second invitation. He turned and bolted through the door, the inspector tripping over his own feet to follow. Elena leaned against the counter, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the folder, then at the man who had just dismantled her greatest nightmare with a whisper. Alessio simply turned back toward the kitchen. "The oven is preheated, Elena," he said calmly. "We have work to do." The scent of yeast and fermenting dough in the bakery wasn't just a smell to Alessio. It was a ghost. As he sat at the scarred wooden table in the back of La Stella, watching Elena meticulously knead a fresh batch of dough despite the chaos outside, the polished veneer of the king of the concrete began to crack. He closed his eyes, and the sound of the rain against the window transformed into the rhythmic thud of a heavy boot against a different door, 30 years in the past. Before the silk suits and the armored cars, there was a small shop in a dusty corner of Sicily, Panificio Ravelli. His mother, Maria, had been much like Elena, a woman whose hands were perpetually stained white with flour and whose heart was anchored by the weight of a child's future. Alessio, only 7 at the time, would sit on a flour sack, watching her work until her knuckles bled. In his memory, the sunlight was always golden until the shadows arrived. The shadows were men with cold eyes who demanded protection money that his mother didn't have. He remembered the day a man named Don Alessio had walked in, not with a weapon, but with a match. "Business is a privilege, Maria," Alessio had whispered, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. "And privileges must be paid for." Alessio's mother hadn't flinched. She had stood her ground, her small frame dwarfed by the thugs, a rolling pin held like a scepter. She told them that the bread she baked fed the hungry and the honest, and she would not give a single crust to a thief. That night, the bakery burned. Alessio remembered the heat, the roar of the flames devouring his mother's dreams, and the smell of charred grain, a scent that had haunted his nightmares for decades. He had watched his mother stand in the ashes the next morning, her spirit broken more than the walls, forced to work for the very men who had destroyed her life, just to keep Alessio fed. It was the day Alessio realized that being good wasn't enough. You had to be powerful enough to keep the wolves away from the oven. Opening his eyes back in the present, Alessio watched Elena. She was exhausted, her eyes shadowed with the looming threat of the bank and the developer, yet she moved with a quiet, stubborn dignity. She was the living image of the woman he couldn't save 30 years ago. He looked down at his hands, hands that had done terrible things to ensure no one would ever burn his house down again. He realized then that he hadn't just entered a bakery to hide from a storm. He had entered it because he was still that boy on the flour sack, searching for a way to rewrite a story that had ended in ashes. "The bread," Alessio said suddenly, his voice low and startling in the quiet kitchen. Elena paused, looking up at him with wide, alert eyes. "My mother always said it was the only thing that could never be truly stolen. You can take the shop, but you cannot take the craft." He stood up, his tall frame casting a protective shadow over the workbench. The blood on his hands felt heavy, but for the first time in years, the smell of the bread felt like a sanctuary. He wasn't just here to hide. He was here to make sure this bakery, this woman, didn't burn. The rhythmic clang of metal against stone echoed through the alleyway, a sharp contrast to the soft bubbling of the tomato sauce Elena was stirring in the kitchen. For days, the atmosphere in La Stella Bakery had shifted from a place of quiet desperation to a fortress of industry. Don Alessio's men moved with a silent, lethal efficiency, but it was the activity hidden behind the heavy steel back door that finally piqued her curiosity. Wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron, Elena stepped toward the rear exit. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the latch. In this world of shadows and whispered debts, knowledge was often a dangerous currency. But the sound was persistent, a grinding of saws and the heavy thud of timber. She pushed the door open just a crack. The narrow alleyway, once filled with overflowing trash bins and the stench of neglect, had been transformed. Floodlights, powered by a silent industrial generator, bathed the brick walls in a clinical white glow. A dozen men in dark work jumpsuits, not the tailored suits of Alessio's personal guard, but professionals nonetheless, were swarming over a structure that hadn't been there 48 hours ago. Elena's breath hitched. They weren't just repairing the old loading dock, they were expanding. Steel beams were being anchored into the foundation of the bakery, extending the footprint of the building into the vacant lot Alessio had apparently acquired in total secrecy. A new, reinforced cold storage unit was already being leveled, its stainless steel doors gleaming under the lights. "It's a foundation, Signora." Elena jumped, spinning around to find Don Alessio standing in the shadows of the doorway, his black cashmere coat draped over his shoulders like a cape. He wasn't looking at her. His intense gaze was fixed on the workmen. "You're building a warehouse," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't afford the taxes on this, let alone the construction. I told you I'm bankrupt, Alessio." He stepped forward, the cool night air following him. He smelled of rain and expensive tobacco. "A bakery is a heart, Elena, but a heart cannot beat without veins. Behind these walls, we are building a distribution hub. By next week, La Stella won't just be selling loaves to the neighbors. You will be the sole provider of bread for every shelter, school, and parish in the district." He looked down at her then, his expression unreadable, but his presence claiming the space between them. "Mr. Sterling wanted to tear this down to build glass towers. I prefer to build something that feeds people. Consider it a silent partnership." Elena looked back at the construction, the sheer scale of it suddenly hitting her. He wasn't just saving her shop, he was weaving her into the fabric of the city's survival. Behind the bakery, in the dark alleyway where she once feared to walk, Alessio Ravelli was building an empire of flour and steel. And for the first time in years, Elena felt the crushing weight of the foreclosure start to lift, replaced by a new, terrifyingly beautiful debt of loyalty. The darkness that swallowed the city wasn't just an absence of light. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that smelled of rain and growing panic. Beyond the reinforced glass of La Stella Bakery, the distant sounds of sirens and the rhythmic thumping of feet on pavement signaled a city losing its grip on order. But inside the bakery, the air was different. It was thick with the scent of yeast, toasted grain, and the sharp, metallic tang of the men who stood like statues in the shadows. Don Alessio stood by the window, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the flickering orange glow of a fire 3 blocks away. He hadn't spoken for an hour, but his presence was a physical force, a dam holding back the chaos of the night. A frantic pounding at the front door made Elena jump, nearly dropping the heavy tray of dough she was prepping. Through the glass, she saw Mrs. Gable, a widow from 2 doors down, clutching a thin shawl around her shoulders. Behind her stood the Martinez family, their youngest child shivering in the damp cold. Elena looked at the locked door, then at the Don. "They have nowhere else to go," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "The shelters are full and the streets aren't safe." One of Alessio's men, a man with a jagged scar across his knuckles, stepped forward to intercept her, but a single, slight lift of Alessio's hand froze him in place. The Don turned slowly. The cooler tones of the bakery's dim emergency lights caught the intensity in his eyes, the gaze of a man used to being obeyed, now weighing the life of a baker against the security of his hiding place. "If you open that door, Elena," Alessio said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "you invite the world in, and the world is hungry tonight." "It's my bakery," she countered, her shoulders squaring even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "And in this house, we feed people." A ghost of a smile, something cold and admiring, touched the Don's lips. He nodded once. As Elena threw back the bolts, the neighbors stumbled in, bringing the chill of the unrest with them. They froze when they saw the dark-suited men stationed in the corners, the sheer aura of power radiating from the man at the window. But then they saw the warmth of the ovens. Alessio didn't retreat. Instead, he watched as Elena moved with a grace born of desperation, handing out warm loaves and pouring mugs of tea. She was a beacon of moral strength in a collapsing world. Under Alessio's silent command, his men, killers and enforcers, began to move, not to intimidate, but to assist. They moved heavy flour sacks to create seating. They stood guard at the glass, their very presence turning the fragile bakery into an untouchable fortress. In the corner, Lucas sat on a crate, watching his mother. He looked at the Don, then back at Elena, For the first time since the lights went out, the fear in the boys' eyes began to fade, replaced by the realization that they were no longer alone in the storm. Behind the counter, Elena caught Alessio's eye. He didn't look away. In that moment, the Bankrupt Bakery was no longer a failing business. It was the only piece of the city that still felt like home. The blackout had turned the bakery into a labyrinth of shifting shadows, the air thick with the scent of cold flour and the metallic tang of rain. Alessio and his men were huddled in the back office, voices low as they tracked a traitor within their own ranks. Elena stood in the kitchen, her hand resting on the heavy industrial mixer, her ears tuned to the rhythm of the storm. Then she heard it, not the wind, but the soft, rhythmic click of a lock being picked at the service entrance. She froze. The Don's men were occupied, their attention fixed on the digital maps and encrypted radios. Whoever was at the side door wasn't one of them. Alessio's men moved with a heavy, confident thud. This was a ghost, a predator. Panic flared in her chest, sharp and cold, but then she looked toward the stairs where Lucas lay sleeping. A strange, fierce heat replaced the fear. This was her bakery. She knew every creaking floorboard, every sticky hinge, and every blind spot created by the towering steel ovens. The door eased open. A man slipped inside, a silhouette darker than the darkness itself. The moonlight caught the lethal glint of a suppressed handgun. He didn't head for the office. He began to move toward the stairs, his boots silent on the linoleum. He was going to use the child as leverage. Elena didn't scream. A scream would bring Alessio's men running into a crossfire. Instead, she reached into the bin beside her and grabbed a massive, 5-pound bag of superfine pastry flour. She moved through the kitchen with the grace of someone who had lived in this space for a decade, slipping behind the massive bulk of the proofing cabinet. As the assassin reached the base of the stairs, Elena acted. She didn't attack him, she attacked the air. With a powerful swing, she ruptured the bag against the edge of the steel table, sending a massive, blinding cloud of white powder into the narrow hallway. The man gasped, instinctively inhaling the fine dust, which instantly coated his throat and eyes. He stumbled, blinded and coughing, the sudden whiteout turning the corridor into a vacuum of visibility. Before he could recover, Elena reached out and grabbed the heavy iron handle of the proofer door, swinging it with every ounce of her maternal rage. The heavy metal slammed into the man's temple with a hollow crack. He crumpled to the floor, his weapon clattering away into the darkness. Elena stood over him, her chest heaving, her uniform covered in white dust like a vengeful spirit. Seconds later, the kitchen was flooded with tactical lights. Alessio was the first through the door, his pistol raised, his eyes wide as they swept from the unconscious assassin to the woman standing over him with a rolling pin in one hand and a broken bag of flour in the other. The Don looked at the vulture's hunter, then back at the baker. For the first time, the cold mask of the Mafia Boss slipped, replaced by a look of profound, humbled respect. She hadn't just protected her home, she had protected his life. The smell of gunpowder and expensive cologne began to settle, replaced by the ghost of yeast and vanilla that always haunted the walls of La Stella. Alessio Ravelli stood in the center of the kitchen, his chest rising and falling in a rhythmic, controlled cadence. On the floor near the cooling racks lay the discarded weapon of the assassin Elena had intercepted. A man who had slipped through the Don's perimeter only to be undone by a woman with a heavy marble rolling pin and a mother's desperation. Elena's hands were shaking so violently, she had to grip the edge of the flour-dusted prep table to stay upright. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the man she had just saved, the king of the concrete, and expected to see the cold, calculating fury of a mafia boss who had been caught off guard. Instead, Alessio was looking at her with an expression that made the air in the room feel thick. He stepped over the unconscious intruder, his polished shoes silent on the linoleum, and stopped just inches from her. The height difference was immense, his shadow swallowing her small frame, yet for the first time since he had entered her bakery, the weight of his presence didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a shield. "You should have run upstairs," Alessio said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly vibration. "You should have locked the door and prayed we didn't bleed on your floor." Elena swallowed hard, her voice a mere whisper. I couldn't let him. Not in my home, not with Lucas sleeping above us. Alessio reached out, his hand hovering for a second before his fingers brushed a streak of flour from her cheek. His touch was surprisingly warm, his movements devoid of the sharp edge he showed his men. My life is a series of transactions, Elena. Every favor has a price, and every debt is recorded in blood or gold. He looked around the humble, struggling bakery, the leaking ceiling, the empty shelves, the $4 in the register, and then back into her eyes. But a life is a debt that cannot be paid back with a checkbook, he continued, his gaze intense and unwavering. In my world, men are loyal because they are paid or because they are afraid. You were neither. You stood between me and a bullet because of a code I thought died with my mother. He leaned in closer, the scent of rain and authority clinging to him. You didn't just save a man tonight, Elena Moreau. You saved the crown. And from this moment on, the walls of La Stella are as sacred to me as the altar of a cathedral. You will never have to be afraid of a vulture like Sterling again, because the king of this city is now in your debt, and I am a man who always settles his accounts. The following morning, the scent of yeast and roasting coffee beans filled the air, but the usual peaceful rhythm of the bakery was replaced by a clinical, high-stakes intensity. In the small booth at the far corner of the shop, the one with the wobbly leg Elena had never been able to fix, 3 men sat hunched over glowing laptops. They weren't wearing the heavy coats of soldiers, they wore thin, expensive spectacles and shirts with sleeves, rolled up to reveal forearm tattoos that hinted at their darker origins. These were Alessio's, accountants, men who navigated the labyrinth of global finance with the same ruthlessness that his enforcers navigated the city streets. Don Alessio stood by the window, his back to the room, watching the rain wash over the cobblestones. Elena approached him tentatively, holding a tray with fresh brioche and a single espresso. "They've been at it for hours," she whispered, nodding toward the booth. "What are they looking for? The debt is real, Alessio, my husband." He signed the papers. Alessio didn't turn around, but his voice was like velvet over gravel. "Your husband was a desperate man, Elena, and desperate men are easy to trick. My men don't look at what is on the page, they look for what is hidden in the ink." One of the accountants, a man named Marco, beckoned them over. He tapped a finger against the screen, where a complex web of shell companies and digital signatures spiraled outward from a single name: Sterling Development. "It's a classic squeeze, Don Alessio," Marco said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Sterling didn't just buy the debt, he manufactured the default. He bribed a clerk in the city records office to backdate the notices. Look here, the signature on the secondary mortgage isn't a wet ink scan, it's a digital overlay. Your husband signed a loan for $5,000 to fix the roof, but they used that signature to authorize a $50,000 lien." Elena felt the world tilt. The weight that had been crushing her chest for months, the shame of her husband's perceived recklessness, suddenly shifted. So, he didn't gamble it all away. "He was foolish," Alessio said, finally turning to look at her, his dark eyes softening for a fleeting second. "But he wasn't a traitor to his family. You've been fighting a ghost, Elena, while the real monster was sitting in a glass office across town." Marco pulled up another file. "There's more. This isn't just about a bakery. Sterling is clearing this entire block for a high-rise project. He's used the same illegal foreclosure tactic on 4 other shops in the neighborhood. The paperwork is a crime scene." Alessio leaned over the table, his presence suddenly cold and predatory. "A crime scene needs a cleanup crew," he murmured. He looked at Elena, who was staring at the screen with tears of fury stinging her eyes. "Mr. Sterling thinks he's playing a game of numbers. He doesn't realize he's entered a game of blood. Keep your ovens hot, Elena. The paper trail ends at his front door, and I intend to deliver the bill personally." The silence of the bakery was different that morning. It wasn't the heavy, hollow quiet of a dying business, but a vibrating stillness that felt charged with electricity. When Elena pushed open the swinging doors to the kitchen at 4:00 a.m., her hand froze on the wood. She didn't scream, though the shock was enough to steal the air from her lungs. The darkness of the blackout was gone, replaced by the low, surgical hum of power. But it wasn't just the lights. The cramped, rusted graveyard of her father's old appliances had vanished. In their place stood a gleaming landscape of brushed steel and digital interfaces. The ancient, temperamental oven that leaked heat and hope in equal measure had been replaced by a triple-deck Italian hearth stone oven, its glass doors reflecting her stunned expression like a mirror. She walked forward in a daze, her boots clicking on a floor that had been scrubbed of 20 years of grease and flour. To her left, a row of high-capacity spiral mixers sat like silent sentinels, their chrome bowls polished to a high shine. In the center of the room was a massive marble-topped prep table, cold to the touch and perfectly level. A baker's dream she had only ever seen in catalogs she'd hidden under her bed, so Lucas wouldn't see her crying over them. There was no note, no signature, but the air still carried the faint, lingering scent of expensive tobacco and rain. Elena ran her fingers over the edge of the new proofing cabinet. It was state-of-the-art, capable of controlling humidity to the exact percentage. Behind it, the back wall had been reinforced, and the leaky ceiling that had been her constant shadow was perfectly patched and painted. She realized then that the construction she had heard in the alleyway hadn't been a threat or a barricade. It had been a transformation. Alessio Ravelli hadn't just occupied her space, he had rebuilt it from the bones up. As she moved toward the back door, she saw a stack of high-grade organic flour and crates of premium butter, supplies that cost more than her last 3 months of rent. A soft sound made her turn. Lucas was standing in the doorway, his eyes wide as he looked at the glowing displays of the new machines. "Mama," he whispered, "did the superheroes come?" Elena looked at the expensive, dangerous shadow of the man standing by the front window, his silhouette barely visible through the frosted glass. She thought of the 11 cents in her pocket and the $45,000 debt that still loomed. But for the first time in years, the smell of fresh yeast and possibility began to rise in the air. "Not superheroes, Lucas," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and overwhelming gratitude. "Just a man who remembers the taste of bread." The heavy iron-hinged door of Stella Bakery didn't just open. It hit the wall with a violence that made the cooling loaves on the racks tremble. The morning light was gray and sharp, cutting through the steam of the kitchen as Mr. Sterling marched in. He wasn't alone. 2 uniformed officers stood behind him, their faces set in the grim, bureaucratic masks of men just doing their jobs. "Time is up, Elena," Sterling announced, his voice echoing with a hollow, practiced authority. He tossed a thick stack of legal papers onto the flour-dusted counter, right next to a tray of fresh cannoli. "I told you the wrecking ball was scheduled for this morning. You're trespassing on private property now. Officers, please escort Mrs. Moreau and her son from the premises." Elena felt the familiar cold prickle of panic rising in her throat. She looked at the officers, then at the stairs where Lucas was surely hiding, listening. Her hands, stained with the morning's work, shook as she gripped the edge of the table. "The deadline wasn't until noon," she whispered, her voice failing her. "I moved it up," Sterling sneered, leaning in close, smelling of expensive cologne and greed. "In this city, the man with the money makes the clock move however he likes. Now move, before I have them carry you out." A fascinating theory about time, Mr. Sterling. The voice didn't come from the kitchen or the stairs. It came from the shadowed corner booth, the one that had been draped in silence for days. Don Alessio Ravelli stepped into the light, his black suit looking like armor against the morning sun. He didn't have a weapon in his hand. He had a porcelain espresso cup. Sterling froze, his face draining of color until he looked as white as the flour on the floor. "Ravelli, what? What are you doing here? This is a civil matter. It has nothing to do with—" "It has everything to do with me," Alessio interrupted, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. He didn't look at Sterling, he looked at the officers. "Gentlemen, you are standing in a place of business. I suggest you check your dispatch. There was a change in the deed filings at the central branch an hour ago." Sterling let out a frantic, high-pitched laugh. "The deed is held by First National. They've already approved the demolition. I have the signatures." "You had the signatures of a bank that was struggling," Alessio said, finally turning his intense, predatory gaze toward the developer. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a single gold-embossed card. "As of 8:00 a.m., First National is a subsidiary of Ravelli Holdings. I didn't just buy the debt, Sterling. I bought the building, the land, and the vault where you keep your pathetic dreams of high-rises." Alessio walked slowly towards Sterling, stopping only inches from his face. The developer retreated until his back hit the glass door. "The owner of this bakery has paid her debt in full," Alessio whispered. "And the owner of this bank, me, decided that your contract is null and void. Now, get out of my bakery before I decide to audit your soul." The silence that followed was absolute. Sterling didn't argue. He didn't look back. He scrambled through the door, his polished shoes skidding on the pavement. The officers shared a look of pure relief and followed him out, closing the door softly. Elena stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at Alessio, the man who had just rewritten her destiny with a signature. "You bought the bank?" she asked, breathless. Alessio set his cup down and looked at her, the intensity in his eyes softening just a fraction. "I told you, Elena, I don't belong in a place like this, but I make sure the things that do belong here stay." The heavy dust of the weeks-long construction finally settled, leaving a silence that felt heavy with anticipation. For days, Elena had listened to the rhythmic thrum of hammers and the low, urgent murmurs of Alessio's men working behind the heavy steel door in the back of the bakery. She had expected a fortress, perhaps a bunker for his business. But when Alessio finally placed the heavy brass key in her hand, his expression was unreadable, his intense gaze softer than she had ever seen it. "Open it, Elena," he whispered. "It is time you see what loyalty builds." Elena pushed the door open, and the breath left her lungs. What had once been a cluttered, crumbling alleyway and a derelict warehouse was gone. In its place stood a vast, gleaming industrial space bathed in warm, amber light. To the left was a state-of-the-art community kitchen, with rows of polished stainless steel prep tables and industrial ovens that could bake hundreds of loaves at once. To the right, a massive distribution center was already being stocked with crates of fresh produce, flour, and essentials. "It isn't just a bakery anymore," Alessio said, stepping up behind her, his presence a warm weight in the cold room. "You told me the people in this neighborhood were starving while the developers waited for them to leave. Now they won't have to." He pointed to the loading docks, where 3 of his men were quietly unloading a shipment of grain. This wasn't a hidden vault for illicit goods. It was a lifeline. It was a hub designed to feed the entire district, with Elena at the helm. He had built a system where the surplus from her bakery would supply the community kitchen, and the distribution center would ensure no family in the shadows of the city went as hungry as she had been just weeks ago. Elena's hands trembled as she touched the smooth surface of a new prep table. She realized then that the construction she had feared was never about Alessio taking more space for himself. It was about expanding her reach. He had taken her tiny spark of resilience and built a sun around it. "Why?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion as she looked up at the man who had entered her life as a monster and stayed as a guardian. Alessio looked out over the facility, his hand momentarily resting near the scar on his jaw, a reminder of a past where no one had intervened to save his own family. "Because a queen needs a kingdom, Elena, and a neighborhood that is fed is a neighborhood that can fight back." In that moment, the bakery was no longer a bankrupt relic of the past. It was the heart of a new legacy, a fortress built not of stone and fear, but of bread and hope. Behind the bakery, Alessio hadn't built a wall, he had built a bridge. The smell of roasting garlic and sweet vanilla drifted far beyond the threshold of La Stella Bakery, reaching the corners of the neighborhood that had long been forgotten by city planners and bank executives. The cracked pavement outside was now clean, and the scaffolding that had once signaled decay was replaced by a vibrant, hand-painted sign that caught the morning light. Elena Moreau stood by the front window, her hands no longer trembling as she adjusted a display of gold-crusted loaves. She wasn't just selling bread anymore. She was nourishing a community that had found its pulse again. The transformation was more than aesthetic. In the months since the blackout, the bakery had expanded into the newly renovated space behind it, the community kitchen Don Alessio had commissioned. Every afternoon, the back doors swung open to residents who needed a hot meal or a place to learn the trade. Elena watched as young men from the block, who once stood on street corners with nothing but time and trouble, now wore white aprons, their faces dusted with flour as they learned the geometry of the dough, just as Alessio had taught Lucas. Lucas himself was the bakery's unofficial mascot. He moved between the tables with a confidence that hadn't existed before the night the black SUVs arrived. He no longer clutched a wooden rolling pin like a weapon. He used it to help his mother, his laughter ringing out against the hum of the new industrial ovens. The fear that had once clouded his eyes had been replaced by a sense of belonging. He knew every neighbor by name, and they, in turn, looked out for him as if he were their own. The vultures, like Sterling, had vanished from the district, silenced by the impenetrable legal shield Alessio's attorneys had woven around the property. The neighborhood felt the change. There was a heaviness gone from the air, replaced by the sound of local musicians playing on the sidewalk and the steady chime of the bakery door. La Stella had become a sanctuary where the poor felt dignified and the weary felt seen. As the morning rush slowed, Elena looked toward the corner table, the one with the permanent, reserved sign. It remained empty, a silent tribute to the man who had seen a fortress in a failing bakery. She realized then that the legacy of her father hadn't been saved by money, but by the recognition of worth. The bakery was no longer just a business. It was the heartbeat of a revived world, a testament to the fact that when someone builds a bridge instead of a wall, an entire city can walk across it toward a better dawn. Elena smiled, picked up a warm tray of rolls, and stepped out from behind the counter to greet her neighbors. The roaring engines that had once sounded like a pack of wolves now hummed with a quiet, respectful rhythm. The 3 black sedans sat idling at the curb, their headlights cutting through the early morning mist of a city finally waking up from its long slumber. Inside La Stella Bakery, the air was thick with the scent of yeast and expensive tobacco, a combination that had become the scent of Elena's salvation. Don Alessio Ravelli stood by the counter, his charcoal cashmere coat buttoned tight, his presence still commanding enough to make the air feel heavy. He looked around the bakery one last time. It was no longer the crumbling, desperate shell he had entered days ago. The walls were reinforced, the ovens were state-of-the-art, and the shadow of debt had been incinerated by his hand. "The world will try to take from you again, Elena," Alessio said, his voice low and rhythmic, like the roll of distant thunder. "Men like Sterling don't disappear, they just wait for the next storm. But they won't come here, not anymore." Elena wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes meeting his with a strength she hadn't possessed when they first met. She wasn't just a victim of a husband's secrets or a developer's greed anymore. She was a woman who had stood with a lion and survived. "Why did you do it, Alessio? You could have taken this place for yourself." The Don's gaze softened, just for a fraction of a second, as he looked toward the stairs where Lucas was still sleeping. "Because the bread was good," he said, though they both knew it was a lie. He did it because for 48 hours he wasn't a king or a monster. He was just a man in a warm kitchen. He signaled to his men, and the shadows by the door stepped out into the morning chill. Alessio paused at the threshold, turning back to look at the small corner table, the one where he had sat and watched the rain, the one where he had shared a simple meal with a mother and her son. "Keep the flour moving, Signora," he said with a final curt nod. As the cars pulled away, the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was peaceful. Elena walked to the corner table and placed a small, polished brass stand upon it. Slipped inside was a card with a single word in elegant script, "Reserved." She knew he might never return. His world was one of shadows and blood, while hers was one of light and grain. But as long as that sign stood there, no developer, no bank, and no ghost would ever dare to cross her door again. The Mafia Boss had entered a bankrupt bakery and left behind a fortress. Elena took a deep breath, adjusted her apron, and turned on the ovens. The storm was over, and for the first time in years, the future was rising. Sometimes the world doesn't need a hero. It needs a Don who remembers the taste of his mother's bread. Elena opened her door to a dangerous stranger and found the father her son lost, and the future she thought was gone. If this story of unlikely loyalty touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more tales of redemption. What would you do if a stranger offered you a way out of your darkest hour? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one. Don't forget to share this story and turn on post notifications so you never miss a moment where the shadows bring the light. Thank you for watching. And may your home always be as warm as Elena's oven.